The whole structure of it, the whole framework of the Canterbury Tales would have again have got up Archbishop Arundel's nose, because it was making fun of something which the church held to be an important part of life. The church said that everybody should go on pilgrimage at least once in their life. And of course the church made a lot of money out of pilgrimage, and cathedrals had a huge income from pilgrimage. And it was one of the points that Arundel eventually makes into a point of heresy. He's got 4 points of heresy, and one of them is denying that pilgrimage is an important, vital thing for the salvation of your soul. Now, when you look at Chaucer's pilgrimage, the very opening lines of the Canterbury Tales, is making fun of the idea of pilgrimage. It says it's April, the sun is in the ram, the sap's rising, the birds are sort of all getting all excited at things, and it's spring, and in spring a young man's fancy turns to thoughts of going on pilgrimage. So it's, he's equating pilgrimage with making love and having a holiday, and that's certainly, again, something that Arundel wouldn't have tolerated. Here beginneth the book of the Tales of Canterbury. One that April with his showers suite, the drocht of March hath pierced to the root, and bathed every vein in such liquor, of which virtue engenders the flower. When Zephyrus eke with his sweet breath inspired hath in every holt and heath the tender coppice, and the younger son hath in the ram his half course run. And smaller fowlers maken melody that sleepen all the night with open eye. So pricketh him nature in her courages, than longen folk to go on pilgrimages. And palmers for to seeken stranger strongs, to ferne hallows couth and sundry lands, and specially from every shire's end of England to Canterbury they wend. So this is the opening of the general prologue to the Canterbury Tales. One that April with his showers sweet has pierced the drought of March unto the root, and bathed every vein in that liquor out of whose strength engendered is the flower. When Zephyrus too with his sweet breath has breathed to life in every copse and heath the tender shoots, and when the young sun has in the ram his half course run. That means it's a zodiacal sign for Aries is the ram. So it means March the 12th to April the 11th. And small fowls make their melody that sleep all through the night with open eye, for nature pricks them so in their courages, that's hearts. Then longen folk to go on pilgrimages, and palmers, those are people who built pilgrims who've been to the Holy Land and brought back a palm. And palmers yearn to seek out foreign strands and distant shrines well known in sundry lands. And especially from every shire's end of England to Canterbury they wend, the holy blissful martyr for to seek, who helped them out whenever they were sick.
The man who has been called the father of English literature, Geoffrey Chaucer, was born somewhere around 1340. The date of his death has been given with some precision as October the 25th, 1400, but even this has been called into question. For all that, more is known about him than William Shakespeare, despite his having been born 200-odd years before. And as for his contemporary, the creator of the haunting Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, we don't even know his name. Most records regarding Chaucer are found in books of account and allow us to track his career through them. though even here some payments are made without any reference as to the service rendered. What is more, the first mention we have of the poet is in 1357 in the household accounts of the Countess of Leicester, by which time he was 17, and the last is in December 1399, when he took a lease on property in the grounds of Westminster Abbey. In one key decade between 1374 and 1384, when he wrote much of his greatest work, there is no record at all. For all that, certain assumptions have been generally made regarding his early life, as well as the gap years. Chaucer was born into a prosperous mercantile family, originally based in Ipswich, a prosperous town 84 miles northeast of London. That he recalled his origins may be suggested by the fact that he satirized the Ipswich merchants in the Canterbury Tales. The town was also a famed destination for pilgrims who came to venerate Our Lady of Grace. Though the family name is derived from the French word chausseur, or shoemaker, his father and grandfather were substantial vintners or wine merchants. Just how well-to-do they were is testified by the fact that at the age of 12, in 1324, his father John Chaucer was kidnapped by an aunt who wished to force him to marry her daughter. She was imprisoned, and the amount she was fined was the huge amount of £250. The fact she was able to pay it indicates the value she must have attached to her nephew as a prospective son-in-law. John Chaucer married Agnes Copton, who became a rich heiress when Chaucer was 9, having been left a number of properties by her uncle, Haymo de Compton. These included 24 shops in the city. Her uncle was the moneyer at the Tower of London. Until recent times, the Royal Mint remained in close proximity to the Tower. Moneyers were burgesses at the very top of their social class. They would represent their town and guild and held a charter from the king himself. Often trained as jewelers, they made a fortune from their trade on the money exchange and were very prosperous indeed. It is thought that Chaucer grew up in or around Cheapside. Cheapside is not today and has rarely been cheap. In Charles Dickens' view, Cheapside remains now what it was 5 centuries ago, the greatest thoroughfare in London. Other localities have had their day, have risen, become fashionable, and have fallen into obscurity. But Cheapside has retained its place and may boast of being the busiest thoroughfare in the world. It remains today an opulent shopper's paradise in the heart of the city and conveniently leading to the Bank of England. Cheapside was never cheap, and in fact the name in medieval English meant marketplace. It was the centre of the great London market, where subsidiary streets indicated their function with names such as Poultry and Bread Street. At the heart of London commerce, it was the ideal location for a respected merchant. London in the 14th century would not have been quite the disease-ridden, overcrowded, stinking sewer that it was to become between the 17th and 19th centuries. As more and more of the population sought to escape from rural poverty, it shared many of the problems. It would have been a maze of twisting alleys between the major avenues, such as Cheapside. Still, the relatively small population of 70,000 when Chaucer was born was incapable of creating such verminous conditions as the crowded masses of later generations were to manage. This population, small as it was, would shrink dramatically before Chaucer was 10, mowed down by the plague. Like all major cities prior to the 18th century, London was mainly made up of half-timbered or wattle and daub houses waiting to burn. Although Cheapside was a market street, it may be taken that due to its prestige, efforts were made to keep it clean, unlike the back alleys. Here offal and feces filled the gutters and overflowed during heavy rains, turning the streets into cesspits. The population was forced to wade through, there being nothing in the way of pavements. Even the tributary rivers of the Thames became stagnant, their flow dammed up by a mix of animal waste and other detritus. In the 14th century, it was not a world where the functions of humanity could long be forgotten. Nearby on Cornhill lived William Langland, one of Chaucer's great literary contemporaries. Born 10 years before Chaucer, he moved to London around 1362. There's no evidence the two ever met, and indeed his work shows a quite different tendency from Chaucer's. His masterpiece, Piers Plowman, apparently the tale of a simple ploughman, eventually identifies this humble worker with the Messiah, who has already come to save the world, Jesus Christ.
Langland starts off with Piers Plowman. It's the underground literature. I have no idea how Langland distributed his work or how it got about, but it was there. And the peasants in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 used Piers the Plowman, as their symbol. So it was kind of an anarchic underground poetry, which Chaucer's wasn't.
London town itself was still compressed within the city walls that the Romans had built to fortify the landward side of their settlement, with the Thames serving as a natural barrier. Started late in the 2nd century, little remains today. Just beyond the walls on the east side lay the Great Tower of London, whose central fort, the White Tower, was built in the time of William the Conqueror, though popular opinion in Chaucer's day credited it to Julius Caesar. In his time as an administrator, Chaucer was to oversee building works and reparation here. Beyond the walls on the northwest lay St. Bartholomew the Great, built in gratitude on account of the miraculous recovery of the founder from fever. On the west, beyond Ludgate, which it was claimed got its name from a King Lud who freed Britain from 3 supernatural menaces, lay a mix of church lands and prime estate leading to Westminster, a town in its own right with a population of approximately 8,000. First came the land belonging to the Blackfriars, and beyond that of the Templars, which had been seized when the Templars had been savagely disbanded in 1307 and handed over to the Knights Hospitaller, who had rented it out to lawyers. As the inner and middle inns, it remains in the hands of the legal profession today. Within its grounds lies the Temple Church, bearing witness to the crusading order that became the greatest financial power of Europe. Beyond lay the most magnificent palace of London, the Savoy. And beyond that again, Westminster Abbey, the centre of clerical power in London, and facing it, the old Palace of Westminster. Church and state are conveniently located side by side, able to overlook each other's activities. All that is left of the palace is Westminster Hall, incorporated into the 19th century Houses of Parliament, the remainder having burned down in 1834. The occupant of Westminster Palace for the first 37 years of Chaucer's life was King Edward III, a king famed in history for his martial exploits. This love of all things military may have been passed down from his grandfather, the Hammer of the Scots, Edward I. Then again, it might have been encouraged by the fact that his peace-loving father had been executed by his baronial subjects in a horrendous manner. Here in Berkeley Castle he had died in agony, having had a red-hot poker thrust up his anus. Whatever the cause, there is little doubt that the barons were more at ease when there were spoils to be gained, and in 1337, claiming the French throne, Edward had invaded France. This is not quite as insane as it might sound. The English had long held the whole of southwestern France through marriage, though it was now lost. Also through marriage, Edward had a not totally unreasonable claim on the French throne, since his mother, Isabella of France, was in the senior line of the French dynasty. The French, however, refused to recognize descent through a woman. However the rights and wrongs may have appeared to a medieval legalist, the war the English king began was to last off and on until 1453 and to become known as the 100 Years' War. In what to a pacifist might appear poetic justice, it would ultimately thrust England into 50 years of civil war whilst leaving France united under the French crown. Overlooking Westminster and at the western side of Cheapside was the vast Cathedral of St. Paul's, high on its hill. The cathedral we see today, the master work of Sir Christopher Wren, took its place after the Great Fire of London finally did for the Grand Cathedral that had managed to withstand many other conflagrations. Magnificent as it is, you could have fitted 4 of Sir Christopher's constructs into the old cathedral, which was the 3rd largest in Europe. Started in 1087, it spread its majesty to such a degree over the surrounding areas that it became a hazard to traffic, and a new gate had to be opened in the city wall to allow access to the main markets in Cheapside. These markets would have had good cause to celebrate when Chaucer was 6, for Edward III, with the aid of his son the Black Prince, had won a famous victory at the Battle of Crecy. It set the pattern for many of the subsequent English victories. Here, the English army of 16,000 had come up against a French force of 80,000, and for the first time in history, the superiority of the English longbow and Welsh archers against the crossbow was proved. Unfortunately for the French, it took some time for this lesson to be digested by them. The longbow was capable of being reloaded every 1 or 2 seconds, against the crossbow, which would take 5. It also had a longer range and greater penetration. As the French crossbowmen were overwhelmed, the cavalry was sent in and mown down in its turn. The scale of the massacre must have mirrored the dreadful slaughters of the First World War. 7,000 archers could unleash 315,000 arrows, or 4 arrows every minute for every Frenchman on the battlefield, with the odds growing less as the slaughter continued. How the great bells of old St. Paul's must have rung with joy. Most likely it was in the school of this cathedral that Chaucer would be enrolled the following year. Every cathedral had its own school attached to it by the 14th century, and although other churches also endowed schools in order to produce clerics whose main function would be to serve the church, it is most likely, given its location and the family's social status, that the young Geoffrey went to the cathedral school, possibly at the age of 7. At least he has left us a picture of an aspiring clerk of 7 years of age learning "Switch manner doctrines as men used there, that is to sayin, to singen, and to read, as small children doon in their childhood." In other words, this 7-year-old is to be taught to speak correctly, and to sing, and to read. Singing comes before reading in his listing, and the ability to sing the psalms and the mass formed the core of a clerical education. The advanced schools taught plain song, with the psalter taking pride of place. However, a recent revolutionary modification had been the creation of grammar schools, in which you were to be taught grammar, Latin grammar. In many cases, logic would also be taught. This development, which was to lead to an increasing secularization of the curriculum, was brought about by the expansion of the universities and was to provide an education whose end was independent of the needs of church ritual. For all that, every school still came under the control of the church. With his schooling barely begun, disaster struck, the greatest disaster that Europe, and indeed the world, has ever had to suffer. It was named the Black Death. Carried to Europe in 1347 by a Genoese ship returning from a trading mission in the Far East, by 1348 it had arrived in London. It found an England suffering from a poor harvest, with grain rotting in the fields, subsequent to heavy rains, and there was famine threatening. By the beginning of November, it had arrived in London. The bacteria were carried in the blood of black rats, and when the rats died, the fleas sought an alternative host, human beings. It was a variation of the bubonic plague, which takes its name from bulbos, fist-sized swellings which appear in the groin, arms, or neck. The bulbos turn from red to dark purple to black. In 2 to 6 days, the victim dies in intense agony. A graphic description of the effects of the disease comes to us from Messina, the port where the Genoese ships docked. Soon men hated each other so much that if a son was attacked by the disease, his father would not tend him. If in spite of all he dared to approach him, he was immediately infected and was bound to die within 3 days. Soon the corpses were lying forsaken in the houses. No ecclesiast, no son, no father, no relation dared to enter, but they hired servants with high wages to bury the dead. It was believed to signal the coming of the end of the world, the apocalypse. The Jews were blamed. Witches were held responsible. Pope Clement VI felt forced to grant remission of sins to all who had died of the plague, since the clergy who should have attended them were dying themselves. Boccaccio said the victims ate lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors in paradise. The Black Death played havoc for the next 2 years, by which time it had reduced the population of London from 70,000 to 40,000. It would return, though in a milder form, throughout Chaucer's life. As it retreated, it left Europe decimated. Unbelievably, the 100 Years' War continued as if nothing else was happening. But things had changed, and in its wake would come social changes that none could predict.
I think in the late 14th century there was, you'd had the Black Death, so the population was very small, and suddenly people were empowered. The reduction in population empowered ordinary people, the ordinary labourers. And it disestablished the feudal society where you stayed on your land, you had to stay on your bit of land because you owed the duty to the lord of the manor. Suddenly, labour was in great demand, and people could go around as day labourers, hiring themselves out. So people felt empowered, and I think that was one of the reasons for behind the Peasants' Revolt. People felt they could do something. They could actually achieve some sort of a change in the way society was run.
After what must have been a greatly interrupted education, Chaucer finally appears in the record books as the page of the Countess of Ulster, Elizabeth de Burgh. The position can only have been obtained due to the influence of his father, for the Countess of Ulster was not only a descendant of the Plantagenet kings, that included Richard Coeur de Lion and King John, but she was married to her cousin, Lionel of Antwerp, 1st Duke of Clarence and 2nd son of Edward III. It is thought that at this time he would have become acquainted with John of Gaunt, the mighty Duke of Lancaster, 3rd son of Edward III, and the greatest landowner in the realm. Amongst his properties was Savoy Palace, the finest home in London. Chaucer's relations with the House of Lancaster were to be of the utmost importance. His job at this time was partly one of being a general attendant, but may also have included a knightly training. The role of page boy was the first step in ascending to the rank of knight, through the intermediate stage of becoming an esquire. Though the poet never progressed to knighthood, either due to lack of support or interest, he did become an esquire. Although pages were recruited from the age of 7, the usual age seems to have been about 14, and Chaucer may well have been in service for 3 years when we first hear of him. Whatever training he received could have taken place in Dublin, and would have taken the form of learning horsemanship, swordsmanship, and archery. Archers had again been the talk of the nation, with the latest great English victory of the war having been fought at Poitiers and won by the Black Prince using exactly the same strategy that had been used at Crecy, except this time not only had the French army been taken apart, but the French King John and 300 of the flower of French chivalry had been captured to be held to ransom. Whatever training Chaucer had received was to be put into good use in 1359, when Edward III once again invaded France, and this time Chaucer went with him, in the service of his mistress's husband, the Duke of Clarence. He was present at the siege of Rheims, but the attempt to take the town ended in failure, with Chaucer a prisoner. He was ransomed in 1360 as the first phase of the 100 Years' War came to a close. At the Treaty of Bretigny, Edward renounced his claims to the French crown, and King John the Good of France acknowledged English rights in Aquitaine. John's ransom was set at 3 million livres, or about £2.5 million. Out of this, Edward could easily afford the £16 it took to ransom Chaucer. The next we hear of the poet is in 1367, when he was working as an esquire in the service of the king, from whom he received a pension for life of 20 marks, 3 marks being roughly equal to £2. In the intervening period, the Countess of Ulster died, and he may have sought and found royal patronage at this point. It's also possible he took advantage of this interval to study at the law courts to gain the knowledge and polish appropriate for a top civil servant and diplomat. If so, he would have been living and studying at the Inns of Temple, by then firmly established as a lawyer's training ground. Although there is no record, it appears that in 1366 he was married to Philippa Rouet. She was in the service of a queen whose name she shared, and like her she came from Hainault. The Queen of England, Philippa of Hainault, had brought few of her countrymen with her when she came to England, so we are justified in supposing that she had a special affection for the family of Chaucer's wife. The Hainault connection also goes a long way to explain Chaucer's great familiarity with tales from the Low Countries. Philippa Rouet's sister was attached as governess to the daughters of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and was later to become his official mistress after the death of his first wife Blanche in 1369, and many years later in 1396 she was to be his third wife. Given the marital connections, relations with the Duke's household, the greatest in the land, were bound to be close. It has been suggested that this bond was due to the fact that Thomas Chaucer, who had gone to become the Speaker of the House of Commons, was not a Chaucer at all, but the illegitimate son of John of Gaunt. The great Duke in his time had both sisters as mistresses. The evidence is tenuous, but shows how influential Gaunt is held to be in the social advancement of Geoffrey Chaucer.